Um, Good afternoon. I'm Kathleen Brackey with the City of Fort Collins Transportation Planning Office, and with me today is Jeremy Klopp from Fair and Piers, and we're here today to talk with you about the Transportation Master Plan for the Fort Collins community. This is a very important element of the Plan Fort Collins comprehensive plan process that we're working on in conjunction with advanced planning and multiple other city departments throughout the organization. We have a lot to cover today on transportation, and it's a very important part of the process. But again, the real beauty behind Plan Fort Collins is that it's an integrated approach, so that as we talk about transportation and as we develop the plan or the updated plan for our transportation master plan, the idea is that it's well integrated with the land use in our community, with the built environment, with energy, the physical environment, natural environment, arts and culture, health and wellness, and high-performing communities. So the idea is that all of the topic areas in Plan Fort Collins are connected and integrated. And with that, I'll move into more of the detailed information about transportation. So we've been working on the Transportation Master Plan update as part of Plan Fort Collins since early in 2010. We've been developing a lot of the information based on input and guidance from the public at large, as well as the city boards and commissions, and also city council. So we have a lot of information to share with you today that we've been developing through that community outreach process and also through our technical analysis. So at this point, I'd like to cover the existing vision that's based on our current Transportation Master Plan that was last updated in 2004, as well as new information that we've developed through this process, and also the integration with the city's budgeting for outcomes process. Because again, the goal is at the end of the day, all of our transportation planning is it aligns and it fits with the overall city goals to help achieve a world-class community. So our existing transportation vision is to provide safe and reliable multimodal transportation options to, from, and throughout the city. By multimodal, we mean transportation for people who are walking, biking, driving their cars, taking the bus, as well as the movement of freight and goods and services. So it's the broad spectrum of the purpose of our transportation system. We also, as part of our vision, see that we have great streets, journeys, and destinations, and that our streets are not just a functional way to get from point A to point B, but they really do provide placemaking for our community and help define our community as a great place to live, work, and play. The linkages with transportation and the budgeting for outcomes results area focus on improving traffic flow, also making sure that we're providing quality travel surfaces and infrastructure in terms of our roadways, our bridges, bikeways, and sidewalks, and that we have an integrated approach to land use and transportation planning. They're very important concepts for us to be planning together to have the most effective system possible. Again, looking at all modes of travel, and increasing awareness and safety for all modes of transportation is a very important part of our vision for transportation as well. One of the unique aspects of the update to the Transportation Master Plan is that we're using a new process. And again, it goes back to the goal of having an integrated land use and transportation approach, as well as integrating with the other areas such as energy and in the environment and health and wellness. In a traditional planning process, it's a much more linear approach. So you start with the land use plan that you'd like to envision as a community, and then you design your transportation system to serve that. You come up with your recommendations, your action items, your master street plan, your capital improvement plan, all of the different improvements and services that you would need to support that original land use plan. So it's a very linear process, and it results in typically a fairly large set of investment strategies, again, for all modes of transportation. What's new and different about how we're approaching the Transportation Master Plan this time is that we have an iterative process. So we're evaluating a variety of different land use scenarios against a variety of different transportation policy choices and seeing what are the pros and cons, advantages, disadvantages of making those different choices so that we're making a collective decision at the end of the day through the community process and through boards and commissions and council that reflects a future of the community that's workable for us and that's realistic and that's a lot more reliable or integrated so that we don't just have a massive list of transportation projects, but we have something that we feel like is workable for our particular community based on the desired land use results. So it is more time intensive, and it does require a lot of thought and analysis provided for each of those different choices. But I think at the end of the day, it's very worth the effort, so that we are making sure that as a community we're making an informed decision about how we want to move forward for the next 10, 20, 30, and 50 years for our community with an integrated plan. As I mentioned, we've been doing a lot of community outreach since March 2010, and we've been hearing some great ideas for our transportation system. And I'd like to share several of those with you today, so that you can see how they serve as the basis for developing the policy choices that Jeremy will be talking more about as we move forward. But some of the ideas that we're hearing, again, it gets back to great streets create great places, and vice versa. And how do we make sure that we have a transportation network of streets and trails and corridors that really help create the special place that Fort Collins is, and that we're doing it in a way that's not only functional, but attractive and welcoming, and feels safe and secure for people. We've heard a lot of input and ideas about transit service, different types of transit, and what our opportunities may be like for the future in terms of not just local transit service, but how do we connect with our regional neighbors. We've also heard a lot of ideas and input about bicycling and walking, and making sure that we have good connectivity. To kind of piggyback on the regional components, we've heard a lot of interest from people in terms of regional connections, not just for streets, but also for trails and for transit. So it is important that we think about how we're linking Fort Collins with our neighbors around us from a standpoint of all modes of transportation, as well as the movement of goods and services. We've had a lot of input and ideas about parking, and again about how do we start looking at our transportation infrastructure system as ways to serve more of the utilities and stormwater conveyance, and again an integrated approach between transportation and utilities, rather than just say more of the traditional model. So lots of opportunities for pairing ideas and concepts together. And then certainly every time we talk about transportation with different groups and public meetings, we get lots of ideas and thoughts about funding for transportation as a very important element. In addition, we're hearing ideas and thoughts about how do we position our transportation system in the future to accommodate new infill and redevelopment projects. A lot of our current standards that we have for transportation, whether it's for streets or bike lanes or sidewalks or transit, has been developed over the last 15 years when we had a lot of greenfield development or new development happening on the edges of our community. But one of the trends that we're seeing for the future is much more infill and redevelopment in the center of our community. So how do we design our streets and travel ways to accommodate that different type of development context than in the future than we have had in the past? Again, a lot of information and questions and ideas about bicycling and walking and transit service, and recognizing that we have a changing demographic, an aging population to serve in our community, as well as young children accessing school sites and their neighborhoods. So a full spectrum of ideas for all ages and abilities. Again, there's some other ideas that we've been hearing about linking more sustainable approaches for treating and conveying stormwater in our streets. How do we look at the medians and landscape parkway areas? How could they be enhanced to provide multiple benefits? And again, how do we make sure that we're creating attractive and welcoming streets and corridors for people, and making sure that they feel comfortable and secure using them at all times of the day and in the evening? Lots more ideas that we're hearing as well in terms of the different policy choices that we've been drafting and presenting to different community groups and boards and commissions, and making sure that they're clear and distinct in the differences between the choices, and really what do they mean at the end of the day if we were to choose one versus another, or are there ideas in terms of different policy choices that could be paired together. So we have gotten a lot of good feedback from people about how to clearly articulate the policy choices and the analysis of each of those. Also, we're hearing feedback from people. One of our policy choices centers around trails and alternative vehicles of the future. So we need to be thinking about what are potential design variations or improvements that we could be making in our off-street system to accommodate not just the vehicles that are out there today, such as bicycles or non-motorized vehicles, whether it's skateboards or new types of scooters or things like that. But there's a whole spectrum of new vehicles that may be on the horizon, and how do we start to accommodate our designs to make sure that we're planning and building a system that accommodates all of those different types of options in the future. Again, we've talked a little bit about the regional connections and a lot of feedback that we've received on the document itself. And again, the important message that we've taken away from the community and that we share ourselves is that, how do we come up with realistic, practical ideas as well as vision ideas for the future. So we're really hearing a lot of great ideas and concepts from people that cover the whole spectrum of transportation. So the challenge has been over the last several months to take all of that information, all of those great ideas, new concepts, ways to expand our existing system, and start to identify different policy choices that would reflect those different directions or approach. And again, they're not necessarily all mutually exclusive. They're designed to just try to target different approaches that we could take as a community for our long-term transportation system. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy to cover the different system and services choices for transportation.
So as Kathleen said, we took the input that we received from the community, from the boards and commissions, and at the council work session, and we really worked to try and generate a series of choices that would capture some of those ideas and package some of those ideas in a way that we could analyze and both qualitatively and quantitatively assess some of the differences between the outcomes associated with those choices. So this is the list of key choices. I'm going to walk through each of them individually and talk a little bit about some of the initial analysis that we've done on each of these areas. The first key choice we termed service reductions or resizing. Now this doesn't mean changing the size of the roadway per se, but really changing the transportation services that are currently being provided to better fit within the existing investments and funding options that are available today. It would really shift the emphasis to only addressing critical issues and move away from expansion of roadway capacity or expanding transit service or bicycle or pedestrian systems. And one of the outcomes associated with that would be accepting higher congestion levels, maybe less frequent maintenance, and potentially reductions in some of the transportation services that are provided today. This key choice was really packaged in a response to concerns about reliable funding long-term for transportation and to address the changing resources that are available to the city in this area. Our initial analysis of this area does in fact show that it would negatively affect transit ridership. It would have the lowest transit ridership of the choices that we're talking about. It would have lower investment costs up front, but it could also result in higher maintenance costs long-term if critical maintenance items are deferred. It has the least effort given to address increasing arterial congestion, and it probably has the lowest ability to serve the changing needs of the populations that Kathleen was talking about in terms of shifts in either vehicle types and or the population demographics in terms of the elderly and the young in particular. The next key choice that we discussed, we term reshaping existing streets. And this concept or choice involves rethinking the existing roadways that the city has available today in a redesign idea to encourage walking and bicycling and transit modes by utilizing the resources that are there today in terms of the pavement width or the right-of-way that's available to reshape and redescribe or redesign those facilities to better serve changing needs in the traveling population. Examples of this might include things like road diets, which is a concept to take a 4-lane facility down to a 3-lane facility and maybe add bike lanes, or change the character of the roadway within the existing right-of-way to better serve changing needs. This would focus really on the quality of the transportation experience and also work to link the design of the street more directly to the context of the land use that's adjacent to that street. So you would have a different design, much like the way College changes in terms of its character in Old Town versus its character in front of CSU versus its character in the southern portion of the city. So we did some analysis on this key choice as well, and the preliminary results here are showing an emphasis on increased transit use, better walkability and bikeability in terms of the metrics we're using to analyze those characteristics. Arterial congestion and the ability to address arterial congestion is less in this scenario because the emphasis is really on reshaping streets to better serve other modes of travel. But there would be targeted investment in transit, walking, and biking types of improvements associated with this key choice. The third key choice we termed enhanced travel corridors, or a district focus. The shift in this key choice is, rather than thinking about a type of improvement across the city, to think more about specific areas or districts where transportation investments would be focused. And the idea would be that we would support land use change very directly in terms of the land use choices that are being considered in other portions of the plan, and support those with needed transportation investments in those corridors, districts, or activity centers. And this could also be really directly applied as an infill or redevelopment catalyst, or a tool to facilitate the type of land use change that's desired. Findings in this category reveal actually the highest transit ridership of the alternatives that we've been looking at. Very high walkability and bikeability indexes, specifically in those areas as well. The investments required to facilitate that would be related to transit and roadway improvements, but primarily in those specific corridors and districts as opposed to citywide. This would also result in a noticeable reduction in vehicle trips overall, and potentially reductions in carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, really taking advantage of the integrated land use and transportation planning. This would also invest in transit in particular, where the land use supports it in a way to provide a big bang for the buck in terms of the ridership and the transit investment. The next alternative that we packaged or described emphasizes alternative vehicle types or trails, and really the changing transportation landscape that we see in terms of trying to facilitate movement of folks on bicycles or electric vehicles or neighborhood electric vehicles, or some of these transportation modes that maybe you saw in the initial futurist presentation, and that really start to raise questions about where the best place in the transportation system for them to be located might be. Should they be on local residential streets? Should they be on arterials? Should they be on the trail system? The idea here is that we could adapt the existing transportation system to meet those changing needs and really emphasize new design standards and approaches that would serve those new vehicle types and trail connections. We also know in this policy option that there would be a high degree of engineering, education, encouragement, enforcement, and evaluation around these new ideas, because they would be new. This 5 E's approach really would require a heavy education component to help people understand how and where they should be traveling, and both on the driver's side and on the folks using the new vehicle type. Some of our findings in this area also reflect higher transit ridership and some vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, reductions relative to some of the other choices. And we also expect higher walkability and bikeability indices with these to improve the options for the way people are getting around. And we also expect greater carbon emissions benefits and lower greenhouse gas emissions with these types of strategies, as well as lower transportation energy use overall. The next key choice that we want to talk about is system and mobility management. This is sometimes thought of as using what we have to its fullest and greatest extent, and how we can maximize the use of what we've already invested in terms of the transportation system through measures that help us manage the demands on the system and also help that system function more effectively. So things like signal retiming or optimizing corridors for the best traffic flow, improving the information available to people through websites or ITS or other ways of communicating times of congestion or situations or transit schedules and information, and really trying to take advantage of new technology that's available and programs that help manage the demand for travel in peak times and really work to move some of those discretionary trips that might be optional in times of high congestion to times when there's more capacity available on the system. Some of the outcomes that we see in this key choice include actually fairly effective ways to address the expected increases in arterial congestion. This has one of the best outcomes on that metric. It also has benefits related to traffic flow and signal timing, and it also helps reduce some of the overall vehicle trip demand on the system, which has energy benefits and carbon benefits. And it also comes with relatively less capital and operations and maintenance investments over time because you're really utilizing what's already been invested in as a city and trying to be more efficient with those things. The next key choice is really confirming the direction that's already been set in the adopted long-term visions. And those include the Master Street Plan, the Transport Strategic Plan, and the Bike and Ped Master Plans, and the existing Transportation Master Plan. Kathleen highlighted some of the existing goals and policies in the existing plan, and much of what we're hearing is that those are still very much valid goals and objectives. This key choice would include continued focus on the capital improvements program that's already in place, and really require identifying new funding sources to achieve those visions in a reasonable time frame. Kathleen will talk a little bit more about the funding options in her section coming up. But this one, what we're finding in terms of the technical analysis is that it also does a great job of addressing the expected increases in congestion. It also results in higher transit utilization and ridership than some of the other options. And it has great walkability and bikeability in terms of those characters. But it also comes with a higher investment package in terms of achieving those outcomes. The last key choice in terms of systems and services for transportation really came out of some of our conversations with boards and commissions who challenged the team to say, what if we want to think about expanding our long-term visions and going beyond and enhancing those visions to further develop the ideas that have been put forth in our existing documents and really push the envelope, so to speak, in some of those areas across the board. The outcomes in this area are very similar to the adopted visions, but with more transit ridership and with better bikeability and walkability and better addressing of traffic flow and congestion, but also with higher costs and investments all around to achieve those same future desired visions of expanding the adopted visions that we have today. I'm going to turn it back to Kathleen to talk through some of the transportation funding choices as well.
It's very difficult to talk about transportation without talking about funding because most all of the policy choices that we are developing all come with a different price tag associated with each of those, whether we're talking about capital cost in terms of building new infrastructure or buying additional transit vehicles, as well as operations and maintenance costs. So we really wanted to make sure we were looking at transportation funding alternatives alongside with all of the various policy choices that Jeremy has presented. So when it comes down to the funding options or choices, there's really two ways to look at this. One option would be increasing the investment in the transportation system to achieve the goals of the different policy choices, and the other option is to accept a reduced level of service to live within our existing means, or in some cases we have diminishing resources for transportation. So it's really kind of a two-sided approach. We can go one way or the other. But it is important to set the context for this conversation, and transportation funding is very challenging. This chart is from information that was shared with the community back in 2009 and has shown how revenue for transportation, again for all modes of transportation combined, has been declining over time. Over the last 10 years, we're seeing quite a downward trend in the funding for transportation today relative to where we were in year 2000, for example. So we need to have this realistic information in front of us as we're making these different choices and saying, given this trend line, what are our options for the future? And if we were to continue with the the current scenario, we are looking at continued shrinking transportation revenues, or hopefully at least stabilizing. But one of the goals for Plan Fort Collins and the Transportation Master Plan is to look at options and ideas for reliable long-term transportation funding. So again, we're trying to show through these different images kind of the glass half full or the glass half empty approach, depending on how you want to look at it. And this is just a particular example about capital funding. We do have some existing funding for transportation, and we've been very successful in securing grant funding, for example, from state and federal sources, fees and other taxes over time. And that's certainly very much appreciated and very helpful in terms of running the transportation system that we have today, our traffic management, our transport service, our bike and pedestrian facilities, the services that we have for street maintenance, all of the important work that we do. But we wanted to illustrate on this slide that there is a difference in terms of the types of funding that would be needed over time to help achieve the different goals, whether it's accomplishing the long-term vision, reaching the top of the glass, or if it's additional funding that would be needed to address the policy choice, for example, of the enhanced travel corridors, is kind of midway up the empty part of the glass. So the idea is trying to take a realistic look at what would the cost look like for each of those different policy choices, and to be keeping that in mind as we're moving forward. And in addition, again, this image is just meant to reflect the capital side of the equation. There's similar analysis that needs to be done on the operations and maintenance costs associated with each of the policy choices that Jeremy described, that some may be lower in terms of capital costs but higher in terms of O&M, or vice versa. The two different funding choices that we've talked about, I'll start with the first in terms of the option to increase the transportation investment to achieve the goals. And this idea is that it would allow the community to move forward and make improvements or investments in the transportation system. This would likely require either new sources of funding or enhancements or additions to the current funding sources that we have today. Some of the ideas that we've talked with the community about over the last several months are, for example, sales tax or different types of taxes. Are there ways to look at the existing revenue from those sources, and are there ways to increase those? Are there other types of fee systems that could be in place, and if so, what types of fees would be appropriate or would make sense? Are there new types of sources that are available from the community, maybe through partnership efforts or new types of districts or other types of agreements with other entities? So we're really trying to look at this from a broad perspective over the long term and look at ideas for, again, a long-term reliable, sustainable funding source for transportation capital and operations and maintenance. We realize too that it's important, as we're looking at all of these different ideas of sources, is it's unlikely that there's one magic answer to the funding picture for transportation. There's not one source out there that would solve all of our needs for today or for the long term. And so we really need to be looking at what is the proper package of sources for transportation, and what is the right mix for Fort Collins and for our community. And then it's important too to think about what our other choice could be in terms of transportation funding, and if are we more comfortable accepting reducing service levels to live within our existing means, and that would be just our current revenue sources. Hopefully they would stabilize over time, but realistically and honestly, it would mean less quality in the transportation services that we provide today, whether that means pavement maintenance or transit service. But we do want to be realistic about what this type of option would result in, or what the outcomes could be for accepting the reduced level of service. Some of the service reductions resulting from this choice would be, again, less street maintenance, reduced services, again, across all modes of transportation, whether it's traffic operations or snow plowing, sweeping, transit service, and less improvements in terms of biking and walking. So these choices that we have before us for transportation funding are very serious and very important, and we need to be thinking realistically about what they would mean what the opportunities could be, what the challenges are, and where do we want to go as a community in terms of that sustainable long-term funding source for transportation. So we're very interested in the community input and feedback. If we've missed any ideas, we certainly want to make sure that we're considering all of the options and all of the possibilities, but we are very interested in people's ideas and thoughts and other types of solutions for supporting our transportation system. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Jeremy, and he's going to cover some of the other analysis that we have.
Great. So we've presented quite a bit of information in this slideshow, and one of the things that we are trying to do to make this a little more digestible and maybe to roll up some of the analysis is a consumer report style summary here. So for each of the key choices that we've talked about, we've evaluated in our initial analysis each key choice against an economic, social, and environmental list of indicators under the triple bottom line sustainability idea that is pervasive throughout the Plan Fort Collins effort. There's a lot of data behind each of these, but I can tell you that we've tried hard to make it simple and understandable, and it will probably change based on continued input. So we'd love to get your feedback on these ideas and help us refine these ideas. But the open circle generally means a negative, the half circle generally means neutral or similar to business as usual, and the full closed-in circle means positive. And so for each of those key choices, we've started to identify which might have the biggest bang for the buck. If you look down the list there, you'll start to see the enhanced travel corridors and districts focus. It's really coming out with some positive results due to its link to the land use and some of the other environmental and social ideas that are in the plan as well. You see that the expanded and enhanced long-term visions also has some benefits there. And you start to see some of the funding and economic impacts of each of those choices as well on the bottom line there. Definitely increasing transportation investments to achieve goals, as you might expect, has a better ability to achieve economic, social, and environmental goals. And the second, accepting reduced services to live within existing means, will provide some challenges and have some negative effects on those three categories as well. I also want to point out that each of these key choices are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Some of them actually make a lot of sense to pair with each other, and we expect, as we refine these, to probably reorganize and repackage some of these based on the input that we hear. To that end, our next steps in the process really are to continue to gather public input on the analysis that we've done and the choices that we've presented, and to hear what both the community and the boards and commissions and council are thinking are the best choices for the community based on the information we've provided. Following this stage, we'll also be refining those key choices and really moving toward developing a preferred direction for the Transportation Master Plan in the fall of 2010, and really starting to define within those key choices that we hear feedback on what exactly those steps look like and what those projects and improvements and costs will look like as we move forward into completion of a final Transportation Master Plan. So thanks for your time. Kathleen and I both are having a great time working on this, and we just want to say thank you for listening, and we'd love to have your feedback and input and getting involved and staying involved in the process.